On this podcast, the guest is Peter Vale. He's the Engineering Information Manager at Thames Tideway Tunnel. The subject of our conversation is digitally enabling people and processes. Hi there, welcome to this episode of BimTube Podcast. So I've got Peter Vale with me today. So welcome, Peter. Thanks for making it.
Thank you, Stephen. A pleasure.
Yeah, this has been a few months in the making because we've been busy. Yeah, we're busy people. This is a good thing. So we speak at last. So welcome. Again, obviously I know you well, but as we've already discussed before, these BimTube podcasts are, I think, for people that do not have a background in our sector. So we'll keep that in mind. Well, I'll keep that in mind, and I'll try not to go too deep because obviously information management is a core part of both our day jobs. But it'd be great if you could just introduce yourself, Peter, what you do now currently, and what would be really important, I think, is how did you get into the role that you have now? So over to you if you could. Be great.
So my current role is I'm the Engineering Information Manager on the Thames Tideway project, and I've been on that I reflected back exactly on this to have this conversation 7 years now, which is quite long, but then big major infrastructure projects do take some time. So on that role, I'm sort of responsible for digital deliverables, BIM, GIS for the deliverables from our contractor. So that's the day job. However, I've been a sort of information manager for many, many years, over the last 20 years, reflection on things from the London Underground through to London 2012, on Crossrail, High Speed 2, and now on Tideway. But my actual background was, I went to a technical grammar, and I think it started there because as a technical grammar, it was all very focused on engineering. So I did woodwork, metalwork, smelting, lathing, you name it, electronics, and that just gets you into it. I think I was also lucky, not trying to be ageist or anything, I'm just over 50. I grew up in the era when we started getting the ZX, ZX and Spectrum, and at 10, my Christmas present was a ZX Spectrum. So I think we were at the right stage of starting to get interested in the technology side of it. But going back to my sort of work background is actually, it's quite interesting because people think I work in civil infrastructure. I'm a civil engineer. My actual background is building architecture. And I think that this is where it all stems to wanting to be involved in the sort of the control and development of information, such that when I left, I went and worked for the government in the Design Standards Office in the architectural department as part of a multidiscipline organization. So we were like the lead consultants, and I was very lucky to get involved in a project from conception all the way through to construction and handover. And I think the hard truth is that academically we can learn quite a lot. Practically, though, you have to experience it. And I was blessed really from going through all of the stages, being in a lead consultant role, coordinating information, and also being at the sort of the right time of life when things like AutoCAD actually came about, and transitioning in that when I was at school, I had to draw by hand. We didn't have computers. So there was this idea that you have to learn, you have to become from a paper-based to digital. And I think that helped me understand the true benefits of coordinating information, but also from the point of view of control. So from there, I got involved in CAD management, and it's one of those sort of, whether it's a control or OCD thing, it's like you start looking at the information that's being produced and you realize that you may only be touching on one part of it, but actually there's a preceding element and a post element. And the frustrations were always that you were very much focused on what you did there and then, without really thinking strategically about what would be of the benefit of the whole project. So from that multidiscipline, I went and worked for an architectural practice, started to get involved in setting up the system, setting up the sort of naming conventions. And in those days, we could do quite a lot with DOS, and it was only 8 characters. So we think about document numbers that can go up to like 26 characters, very complex, following sort of the BIM structure. We had to do all of that with 8. And I think actually that helps me ground from the point of view that, yes, technology's there, but you don't have to use technology for the sake of technology. You don't have to go for complexity. If at the end of the day, we simple humans deal with simple things, and if we can keep something that can be quite complex, simple, in the way that we actually deliver it and the way we communicate and train and educate people, the technology should be there to enable us, not to hinder us. So, I went through that, then worked. I think part of my sort of mind step into moving from one job to another was, well, we've got all these things like document management systems. So I went and spent 2 years with Excitec, which was a consultancy, Autodesk, and got involved in things like Terminal 5 and BAA and the document management systems and consultancy around how you then manage and control that. And I think that gave me a great insight to start engaging with clients from understanding what they need as a consultant and come up with solutions that would actually give them what they actually need, not necessarily sell them a product that may or may not actually give them what they need. And that gave me a real insight in doing test plans, understanding the limitations of document management systems and transmittals. And I think that's, again, this all comes down to the fact of, it's not necessarily what you know, it's what you experience, to be able to make a judgment call or be a sort of able to understand the IT speak and understand the engineering speak and be somewhere in the middle to help support it. I've had myself described as a necessary evil from the point of view of an audit perspective, and the fact that working in a sort of design side, we've got liabilities, CDM requirements. We need to have an audit trail for the purpose to protect us as well. So that from that point of view, and then moving on from there, working on going from sort of building architecture, I went into rail at London Underground, and that was quite an interesting insight, because you come into an environment where people think that, oh, he's never done rail before, so how can he do his role? Well, the reality is that actually CAD management, information management is generic. It's not specific to a particular industry. The principles are the same. It's all information management. If you went on Wikipedia, it talks about the creation of information from multiple sources, the custodianship, the distribution of that information, who needs it, disposes, archiving, deletion. That's not specific to rail. Now, within those industries, you have different disciplines that are specialists, like rails, rolling stock and signals, but ultimately, they are still delivering information. And our job really is to understand what they're doing and start to create some structure to the chaos, potentially. And then luckily from there, moving on to, I moved from there to Arup, and was then lucky enough to work on London 2012 as their sort of information manager, coordinating the design, GIS, CAD, BIM, working with the client, and progress from there. So, and then I've been an information manager on Crossrail and High Speed 2, and where I am now at Tideway.
Great, thanks, Peter. There's a strong rail theme there, but obviously you've said the skills go across multiple sectors. Of course, now you're not working on rail, but you will have touched on it, and of course I know, but maybe again for the benefit of people that surprisingly maybe don't have a background at all in BIM or anything like that, could you just explain a little bit of your involvement with the government BIM initiative?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was at Excitec, it actually stems before Terminal 5. It was looking at big projects, and BIM isn't new. It's all about taking the best practice of how you name, structure, manage, and control information. And Mervyn was on T5, like one of the people that created the BIM graphic.
Mervyn Richards, for
exactly.
The benefit of people.
Yeah, sorry. So and what happened from T5 is it became Avanti, which was a way of describing some what we would call collaborative processes of naming and controlling information, and then that transitioned into the BIM standard BS 1192 part 1 in 2007. So because I've been working in lead design as architectural or with clients, BIM to me is something that we were doing 25 years ago. All that's happened is that we've slowly codified and created a standardized structure that was acceptable, yes, on major programs. And part of the problem is actually then downscaling that to smaller projects, etc. So my involvement with the government BIM task group is that I was lucky enough that when I came off of Crossrail and went to High Speed 2, I was then actually seconded into the government BIM task group. Had to do an interview with Mark Bew and Terry Stocks, and they had some strong views about how we were doing things at Crossrail. But hey, I got the job, and I was lucky enough to spend about 7 or 8 months with them working to deliver BIM Level 2, which was part of the government mandate. So the mandate was exactly on the core government departments. So I worked primarily with Highways England at the time, which is now been rebranded as National Highways, to help them go through that journey about preparing themselves about what BIM meant to them, to benchmark them, to support them in starting that journey. So by the time that they had to deliver BIM Level 2 on new projects, they were ready. And the reason why High Speed 2 sponsored me to go in to do that was that when I finished my tenure with the BIM task group, I then went into High Speed 2 and helped them develop and share that best practice that we had got from the task group to look to help develop the sort of internal High Speed 2 BIM strategy, and to ensure that the departments were set up and were focused on exactly what the other government departments were to do. And likewise at Tideway, from leaving High Speed 2 and Arup to come to Tideway, was that although we weren't mandated, we were part of Ofwat and government backed, and we felt, and from experience on Crossrail, London 2012 and High Speed 2, that Tideway really needed to deliver to the same Level 2 requirements back 7 years ago, to the point where we were actually quite blessed that when I was on the task group, we had pilot projects, and those pilot projects hadn't actually then developed into the final sort of BIM Level 2 requirement that all projects needed to be doing. When we went to tender on Tideway, and that was before my time, the PAS 2, which was the Capital Works BS 1192, had just come out, and we were able to incorporate that into the tender. So in a way, we were not even a pilot project. We could argue that Tideway, as a sort of BIM Level 2 project, was the first project that really went live and committed to deliver to that principle. And so we are still doing to this day, etc.
That's great. Thanks, Peter, because it's also in the timing, isn't it? Like you're saying, the Part 2 came out and the timing was there, and I realize you said that was before your time, but it was there was enough there at that point to keep momentum, and that's really good. If I can just sort of, if you like, completely change topic, because obviously we could talk at length about the BIM standards and all that, but just generally at a completely higher, more abstract level, just about information management, what do you think are sort of some of the key challenges today just with information management that you see? So again, you don't necessarily need to give specific examples. So the top 3 challenges just around IM, it doesn't have to be necessarily related to BIM directly, but yeah.
So the biggest problem is a common language, is understanding what we mean. And I've just been recently looking at what is information management, what is BIM, what is data management, and to be honest, they're broadly all the same thing. However, we talk about BIM as the elephant in the room. You talk to different people at different stages, at different levels of maturity, and ask them, what do you think BIM is, or what do you think information management is? And they will all come back with something slightly different. And that isn't a bad thing. That just highlights the fact that there is not necessarily confusion, but people are on different points of their journey. And I think the real hard fact is that we mix it in with digital. And if you said information management to sort of an IS organization, they would talk about data management and their applications and cloud and software as a service, etc. Yes, that's information management. And then my role here on Tideway is engineering information manager, from the point of view that I'm looking at really the information associated with the engineering and the construction of the project. Whereas we also have a corporate information manager who is responsible for the corporate retention creation and disposal of documents. So that's one of the biggest challenges, is actually having a common language that we don't get confused around what we're all talking about, because to be honest, they're all the same thing. And that's part of the benefit of what the BIM standards were all about, which was trying to write down and articulate exactly what we mean by BIM as a process. Whereas information management is actually more all encapsulating of that. And I think, yeah, so that's the language is one of the problems.
Yeah.
I think the other issue is really technology, is that, you know, everything can be solved by technology, where naturally the purpose of this is people are the people doing it. Yes, we can automate some of the more mundane routine things, but people process technology in that order. And quite often at the moment, whether you're looking in the supply chain selling products, or the idea is it's the knowing the unknown, and people tend to latch on what they can understand. And I think the problem with information management is it's a very fluid sort of subject, in that it covers lots of different aspects which can't be done by one person, because in theory, if you have a mixed organization through corporate, through construction, through operations, through maintenance, to capital works, you know, they all have their own individual requirements interlaced with technology and processes. And I think the problem is we think of it in too finite a term, in that it needs to be black and white. But the reality is it's not black and white. Each needs to be pigeonholed. So there is that problem that, you know, we focus on technology, we don't have a common language around what we mean, and they all become barriers. Because actually, are we delivering technology for the sake of technology, or are we actually looking at what people need, what the organization needs to deliver, what is their driving business requirement? And then actually, you know, do we just improve what we've already got? Because there's that innovation jump, really, where everyone is trying to cope with the technology bubble. You know, I've been coping with it since I was 10, and it's only getting faster and faster. We've got tablets and phones, etc. We've got technology that can do amazing things, but you still need to have the people that understand it, that can integrate and interface with the different elements of the organization to make sure that it's relevant. So the three things here is the language, it's focusing on people, and technology really is, I think we need to draw a line in the sand, and actually focus more on what we can do with what we have. And that needs to come from an understanding and sort of leadership perspective, to actually be able to, that a lot of the problems come from a lack of understanding and a lack of willingness to make the right decisions.
Yeah, great. So, thanks, Peter. I was just thinking about your comment there about the technology. I certainly often think that when I started my career, which isn't that long ago, sort of in the year 2000, where the limitation was the technology.
Yeah.
And it was in between this manual and digital sort of mapping. I started my career in mapping, but now the limitation are the things that you've articulated. I completely agree with you, and it's probably not the technology, you know, because AI, we can kind of do anything within reason, can't we? Now,
but we need to keep it simple. I mean, as I said, I go back to being able to run a major project using an ISDN line where we were running 64K. You know, we talk about 300 megabits now, fiber, and 8 characters. You know, so the idea is you could do it then. All that technology has enabled us is to support this concept of live collaborative working, which was this idea of a common data environment. So the technology, some parts of technology and the infrastructure has certainly helped us get the job done. With complex projects, having structure, naming, having workflows and folder structures, which again is what the BIM sort of structure was talking and articulating, helps us just get on with it. But there is sometimes where we overcomplicate it. And I think this is the problem that we have, is that from experiencing it, from doing complex projects in a simple environment to now being able to do complex projects in an amazing environment of what technology can do. But we as humans can only know so much. We can only take so much. And actually too often, this is where you have this problem between, you know, specifying what you need working with IT professionals who know technology but don't necessarily know how to actually do it. And the change management aspect with any change is always going to be, is it going to help the individual, or is it going to make their life harder? And the reality is, if you make their life harder and you don't necessarily invest and train and explain that to them, they'll switch off. Which is why I think I've had a good example where we were looking at 3 different projects, all using the same sort of processes and tools. One succeeded, one was okay, one failed. And actually, when they looked at it, it wasn't the technology, it was down to the fact that you had a key champion that believed in it, that exuded confidence, engaged with the people, explained to them why they're doing it and what they were doing, and they took them on that journey. And the other 2 failed because there wasn't those key people in place. And as an information manager, I love tech. I love tech. I'm a bit of a digital nerd. I can talk to IT people, I tinker myself, but I also have an engineering background, of heart, and I'm that sort of person that can talk to both sides. Now, on a big project, that's really useful. That's a sort of skill set, though, that we need to impart on everyone, because as we get onto smaller projects and we go down to the supply chain, the reality is their project won't necessarily be able to support an individual information manager. And that's part of the benefit of being on major projects. And this is the same concept in BIM ISO 19650, is the fact that, it's not about having an information manager who is responsible for the CDE. It's about having roles that are responsible for it. And an individual can have multiple roles, but we can't potentially get them to do everything. So it's a complicated world. We need structure, we need people, but we also need to have a clear way of investing and training in our staff to be able to just get on with it, and that's been quite lacking really in the industry for many years, and is a problem I guess will be with us for a while in the future too.
Thanks, Peter. Again, I completely agree with your sentiment. I just, if you had infinite budget and you're in charge of all the government training initiatives around this, what would you recommend? What if we were to tackle the skills gap or the skill? Where would we focus, do you think?
So again, so we talk about how oil and gas is really good, but even within different industries, they have different drivers, different regulations, etc. One of the biggest problems is that we always try and reinvent the wheel, and we don't necessarily invest in change management. So we roll out technology, and then we send people on a quick training course, and then we leave it to them. So it's like having a garden, in that, like, you do, if you don't invest in the gardeners after you've actually created this landscaped utopia, very quickly the weeds will grow, and it will go from something that's beautiful into something that was wild and rough and ready, etc. So you can't just come up with a solution. Really, it's more a case of, what is the maturity of each of the organizations or industries, and where do we need to focus our effort on? And actually, introspectively within an organization, that's part of sort of the principle of Project 13. That's the Institutes of Edge's Project 13 approach to digital transformation. It's around people, processes, and technology to manage the golden thread of information, etc. So how do you achieve that? Is that you look at the maturity of an individual organization or an industry. But to do that, you need to understand what is it you're actually marking against. So this is already happening at the moment. So I don't think you can wave your magic wand and solve all the problems, because there are other things like insurances, that regulations, commercial contracts that drive behaviors that necessarily mean that you can create the perfect solution, or you can train people how to do things, like actually how to press the buttons and get the most out of it. But if they're not taught how to collaborate and how to work in an environment where you don't hide behind commercial contracts, or the insurance creates a behavior in people in that they won't necessarily take a risk or actually work collaboratively because there are consequences. It's not one thing solve all. But there is a real need to train and invest in our staff, and that has to start at the client group level to come up with a plan to drive that within their supply chain, not necessarily fund it, but actually articulate what they want. And it might be actually doing more with what they already have rather than trying to use the next piece of technology. So I'm not saying don't innovate, but actually look at what you've got and actually see if you can do better with what you already have. And actually that's also a good starting point, because it's within their control, within their budget, to understand what they have and deliver change. And this comes into this challenge in the BIM world, where we talk about organizational information requirements and asset information requirements. They drive the EIR, but within organizations you typically have a capital and an operational side that have different requirements that don't necessarily talk to each other. So it's a complicated thing, but I think it has to start from the point of view of industry needs to start to articulate what we think the capability is and how we can strategically move forward. And that's something like the Infrastructure Projects Authority are doing with their roadmap to 2030, where in there, in theory, there's embedded in that the new information management mandate to really reinforce things like BIM and these sorts of digital ways of working forward. And to be honest, there's too much going on. I think when you start looking and scratching the surface of what government is doing and what the sort of BIM world is doing and what the client groups are doing, there's lots of stuff happening. And it's really great to see that. However, there is a risk that the effort is being watered down and defocused, because we talk about collaboration is about removing and breaking down those silos and sharing good and best practice across each of them. And there's some great examples of where that's happening, but there's also great examples where, to be honest, a lot of the improvements are happening at local level and aren't being shared because they see that as a commercial gain, for instance. And sort of my role at client level has always been, whether it was at High Speed 2, Crossrail, or even on London Underground with tube lines, is how do you engage that supply chain? How, as a client, can you work to improve? And I think in construction we've got low profit margins. That drives sort of behavior, and I think this aspiration of moving away from lowest price to better quality, is something that has to happen, and you need a strong client. And I think it's not government coming in and saying you can do it. It's actually giving some guidance with the institutions, with what the government did with the Centre of Digital Built Britain, that came to an end in March, but took the BIM mandate, took the digital twin. They're great. It's how the clients apply that and work with their supply chain, and then ultimately how do we collaborate and share best practice.
Great, thanks, Peter. I think message I'm getting there is it's all the wider sort of network, and then obviously system of systems, which we'd like to talk about in that.
Yep.
But how do things link? And then in my mind, some of the things, or quite a few things that you've said there, remind me of it's process driven. I know that's the implication of what we've said, but I think that's the absolute key thing, isn't it? Just to spell it out again for people that are new to what we're sort of implying, it is the process. We're help enabling the process and processes. And have you got anything? Go on, Peter. You wanted to say something?
Yeah. No, I was going to say exactly right. And part of looking and understanding why is it that we do what we do. Some of it is a legal requirement, freedom of information, etc. Some, when it comes to IT and asset management, there are standards that have been created because we need to standardize our approach. With design, you've got CDM, which influences the behavior. So there's lots of different sort of requirements, and it's understanding what they are, of why we do it. And that forms part of having a digital strategy, which takes into account the people, the process, and the technology, in that the process is, where we can create consistent processes, it's easier to then train people to follow those processes, where whatever organization, whatever industry they're in, it's all about actually not having to reskill every time. So we talk about in the BIM approach is at each gate stage, the idea is you're duplicating effort and becoming inefficient. Having standard processes and standard language is all about the fact of, with the small resource pool that we have and resource pool coming up and being trained, we're trying to remove the inconsistencies to such that we can create a sort of mobility to enable us to very quickly fill the gaps or go from one project to another project. How often, for instance, to ask the people here within your own organizations, how consistent are you on every project? Now, the bigger the organization, the more siloed it becomes. And the reality is that you might find that they are doing things very well, following their own processes, but independent of everyone else, which means that they are locking themselves into minimizing or retraining people to work in that environment. And that's the whole principle of trying to deliver BIM, is not to tell everyone that you have to do it a particular way. It's providing a tool set and a sort of set of ammunition for them to utilize and not reinvent the wheel, such that we're all speaking the same, we're all doing the same, and being aware that we can innovate and improve all the time. But if we innovate and improve, we need a mechanism to then share that back to the industry to make those improvements.
Great, yeah. Something that we've alluded to, not said by name, but have you got anything to say about interoperability? So again, I wouldn't normally go for the long words. It's not the right audience, but if I don't mention it, then have you got any examples of either where that's currently being done well, or conversely, any examples you've seen throughout your career where that hasn't gone so well and what the consequences were, just so people have an idea of the impact?
So the principle of interoperability is about the fact that data is ones and zeros. And too often in the past, we've been led down a proprietary route. So for instance, at Crossrail, we specified the product had to be based on Bentley. So that meant that those supply chain members that hadn't used Bentley had to use it. Whereas at Tideway, we gave the flexibility. So interoperability is really defining some data structures in an open format or in a structured way, whereby this concept of digital twins or ecosystems or systems of systems is that we can produce data, whoever, as blocks of information, and we can join them together and they can understand each other. So part of the sort of the things like COBE, IFC, following Uniclass, it's all about standardizing data in such a way that it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to change what you've got. It's that you understand the rules that you're following and what that means. And then you can either create an API to create that sort of linking, because I don't think the idea of a digital twin is not that everyone will follow the same data standards. I think it's what we're trying to aim for is consistent, good quality information, whether it's documents, whether it's CAD information, whether it's databases, geospatial. It's like, one of the terms I gave was, it's always better to be consistently inconsistent rather than inconsistently consistent, because the idea is, as long as you're doing it the same way, you can then, through data science or through APIs, and you can link that data together, because you can trust that the data that you've produced has been created following a set of rules. Too often those rules are historical, are focused on the history of the organization or the industry, and that's part of what things like Centre of Digital Built Britain, the BIM with the IFC COBE following Uniclass, is again that we talk about a common language, and while we describe what things are, we're trying to create some structure and order in the data we produce to be able to do things with it. A good example is NUA, the National Underground Asset Register, where they're looking to take geospatial information of underground assets from different client organizations, but then understand, just being able to share data is quite a challenge legally, but then also understanding what that data is to be able to graphically show it, like a Google Maps, because we take for granted things like Google Maps turning on traffic, etc. That's all being procured and run by Google, whereas Newer is about taking information from local authorities and organizations and being able to portray that together. So there are some good examples. I mean, there's always going to be bad examples, etc. But I think they more stem from the fact of where you don't control your data. So the idea is, you know, this is why we talk about quality management. You know, ISO 9001 principles is the fact that if you've said that you're going to do something, you follow that. You know, and that's why I'm saying it's better to be consistently wrong, because it is consistent. If you're always doing it the same way, you can fix that later. You can change it, or you can create some clever joining up. But a good example would be when I was at Crossrail. It was all about how do we produce asset information. You know, in Crossrail we called them AD4s, asset data dictionary documents. And I think the analogy that we gave is that you can call a cup, a mug, a vessel, a beaker. They all have different terms, but they all have a volume. So that volume can be in milliliters. If we all agree that the volume is the volume, it doesn't matter that we call them different things. And that's what's happening at industry level through things like BIM for water, BIM for rail. I know went through that process of trying to link up the different rail, network rail, Crossrail, high speed 2, and that's something that's happening around the asset information world. I know that BIM for water are looking at data standards and product data templates to try and align the water companies such that from a data point of view, that they are starting to define and create information the same way. And what's the benefit? Well, the benefit is that things like COP26, they talked about how we can start taking information from geospatial, from the power network, from the water companies, that during the flood, they can start bringing together this information to make some really strategic impacts live. You know, and this, you can't do that if we can't understand what the data we have and how it links together, and how do we graphically portray that. You know, so they're all good examples of why, and that's part of what the National Digital Twin project was all about, and it is still continuing beyond Centre Digital Build Britain through the Digital Twin Hub to try and create some order in the information that we're producing day to day, to leverage some real improvements to really, I think, Mark, you talked about BIM Level 3 and BIM Level 4, and it was all about how you structure your design data, how you then interface it into a sort of a cloud-based environment to link up with other information. He hadn't described how it was going to be done, but and then ultimately, where do we really benefit us in the wider context, you know?
Yeah, that's great. I was just thinking, when you're talking about BIM Level 3 and 4, there's elements of that, not the whole thing, that obviously exist partly in the geospatial or GIS context already, like the Open Geospatial Consortium has been liaising with Building Smart, for example. I know there's some, but if I may just ask you straight up, because you've alluded to sort of GIS, can you say what mapping or GIS or data visualization, don't need to name the products, but what kind of map portals do you have at Tideway? Do you have map portals, I guess is the question.
Yeah, so at Tideway we use Esri as the product. We've actually publicly enabled, for instance, through our webpage, where the location of our TBMs were. So that's something that we integrated and shared information. As a client, we host a lot of information, bathymetric, post office, etc., that we make available to our contractors, who are responsible to do a lot of the local consenting and working with the local authorities, such that as a client, we own that, we pay for it, and that's what the contractors use. And internally, for instance, our property group use it extensively around working with Thames Water and the local authorities to understand ownership, land parcels, and the land handback that we're going through now. So, but a platform's a platform. I mean, ultimately, it's layers and layers and layers and layers of information that's graphical, and it's one part. You know, we talked about BIM being now in 1192. It was graphical and non-graphical. It's now geometry and non-geometric, geometric and non-geometric. To be honest, and this is where I think my idea is BIM is information management, as you allude to, better information management, because it describes the three elements of what information is. It's the document records, the outputs that form part of information management about retention and disposal. It has geometric, which is what we're quite comfortable with 3D models, etc. But it doesn't necessarily have to be 3D. It's also applying 4D. It's actually, and then we have the geometric, which is everything else. It's all the data. It could be your risk data. It could be your health and safety. It could be your GIS, etc. All of that's being produced. All of it needs to be managed, and the real benefits will be is not only controlling it locally, but then bringing it all together to be able to find, share, and make some real benefit and decisions based on that information in its collection, so to speak.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. That it almost, to some degree, the type of data information or model doesn't make any difference. I still think there's something compelling about data visualization and mapping. So ironically, even though my career is in mapping, I go too far the other way sometimes and just say, don't worry about that bit. But it is a hook, isn't it? It is a hook it is noteworthy, when you can you gave examples that you were sharing information with the local authority through a map portal.
Yeah.
It might be technically easy in inverted commas, but at the same time, it's a big deal.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? For some.
So even going from 2D to 3D, the whole concept of getting planning approval by providing a sort of three-dimensional now, and historically it may have been a rough and ready sketch 3D in ArchiCAD that the architect then uses as a basis to create a pretty picture. We've moved on to the point where if you actually start building and designing it properly with standard components, it's very easy. So it's all about utilizing what you've got, and even it's blurring the lines now between the GIS and the CAD, because you've got those that said everything needs to be done in CAD, and others will say everything can be done in GIS. And the hard truth is we should be using the best product for the best purpose that's easiest to produce. However, part of in the Autodesk world with Esri and integrating with Revit, for instance, the key one is having that central model and then being able to do things with it. And we are still human at the end of the day, and we need to make decisions. And we need as much information as possible. And actually, a visual cue is the easiest way to interpret. You'll have those nerds, so to speak, and I had that at Crossrail, where we talked to our maintenance people that would look at a spreadsheet, and that spreadsheet, they could read it, they could understand it around maintenance and rail. We wouldn't have a clue. You put that into a GIS environment and interpret it into a sort of geometric visual, people can understand it. But the benefit you could then do is the trend analysis. It's not necessarily done in GIS, but you can take data from multiple forms and then use that to be able to make sort of proactive decisions based on risk, based on maintenance activities, to understand if there was a trend between what had the age, the location, and why things were failing. Again, an individual can do that, and that's part of what AI and machine learning is all about, which is not to take away a human, but is to sort of automate and speed up those processes. From in the good old days on London Underground, of how the reason why we didn't run 24 hours is an engineer walked along the track in the evenings checking for cracks in the rail. Then you put a camera on a train that can run, but that's still 12 hours, that's still 4 hours of rail. You then you put it through an AI machine that can take that, speeds up the process. It's not going to then make decisions. It's going to flag based on a set of rules that then an engineer can then make a real decision there and then to go and investigate. And this is the wonder of technology, and is to support improving our working processes. But ultimately, we still need to do these roles as such.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Peter. I was just perhaps moving away from Tideway just for a moment as well to broader sort of information management. You mentioned AI, machine learning. Is there anything you personally, or it could be at Tideway, that you've seen that's sort of innovative or with regard to machine learning or AI?
Within Tideway, no, I mean,
or outside. I mean outside. Now, what have you seen sort of personally? There's always something to watch, maybe some emergent technology you think, oh, that'd benefit Tideway, something like that?
So not necessarily Tideway, but I mean, the sort of things that I've described is automating design. So there's been some really interesting ones in the sort of highway environment where they have got very specific specifications around design constraints, and based on that, they put that into a system, ran a sort of AI machine learning routine to come up with what would be, in theory, based on the specification, some perfect road designs, where the gantries, etc., were the sight lines, which is great because what you can now do is it's all about speeding up. So instead of actually one individual spending 6 months doing something, what you're doing is that you're now starting to speed up the whole process for the engineers to then make some real decisions real time or a lot quicker. And being quick and efficient is all about everything that we need to do, because that will save money, that enables us to take into account particular issues that may come into being. I mean, we're building a massive tunnel that will become a sewage network. So we've asked our contractors to run scans to check on cracking, etc. It's not necessarily going to be like a railway where we'll have a running track that needs to be checked on. But I mean, the rail industry do this all the time, where in the past they put cameras on yellow plant, which meant that was the maintenance of equipment that would be done at weekends or in evenings. Whereas now the aspiration is that you're putting those sort of cameras and that technology on running trains. So this idea is you're capturing lots and lots and lots and lots of data, and that creates its own problems, because how do you manage? You talk about capturing cloud surveys, etc. They're huge, but the idea is why are we doing it and what's the benefit? And it all comes back down to is, what are the business benefits of doing something quicker? What are the deliverables? And then that's where the technology can come in to support that, etc. There's lots of examples of AI and machine learning around even spatial. They're using that with drones to be able to look at spoils where they're doing volume captures and doing iterations. I find it really funny that you talk to the sort of chief technology officers and that even from Bentley's and that, everything can be solved by technology. It's like, well, I guess it can be, but you need to understand what is it you actually want, and then how much are you willing to spend? Because you could spend a lot of money getting perfection when you could spend a lot less and get 90%. And there's that hard truth that we're now moving into the sort of data scientists, that we're talking about. The industry needs to not only employ engineers, but to employ data scientists to manage all this information, to do the work, to give the engineer something that they can actually make a decision on. And I think the problem you have at the moment is that some organizations are going down that approach. Others, they don't know what to do, because do they employ someone? Do they train up existing staff? It's the same argument from going to 2D to 3D CAD. I remember the sort of industry for a car that was going on about the fact of, well, what happens when a person that is a perfect person at 2D can't draw at 3D? Do you let them go? Do you just try and retrain them? Should they then be given a different task? So we can only do so much ourselves, and I think that's coming back to the fact of, yes, you can do AI, you can do machine learning, but what's its purpose? And then how will it benefit the business? And is it being done in isolation, or is it being done as part of a strategic sort of an approach to leverage technology and your existing capability and what the staff are doing in their day job, etc.?
Great, thanks, Peter. One of the things I was going to ask you is about roles, but I think you've probably already answered it. You mentioned data scientists, because again, we work in this field, but again, people new, particularly younger people coming into this field, the question would be, well, what on earth kind of job title should I look for? Would one look for? You've mentioned data scientists. Do you employ people called data scientists, or is that something that you see other posts?
Not on Tideway, but from Infrastructure Client Group, I know that the organizations where they have set out a digital strategy, they have data managers, because we're talking about even asset information. It's all data. Geospatial is still data. And this is where I go back to, we talk about information management, we talk about BIM, we talk about data management. They're all broadly the same thing. But the idea is, you know, as we move into this world where we start valuing data as an asset, and we have senior exec leadership who understand it and champion it. So we talk about this idea of the digital twin is exactly that. You have a physical element that represents your assets. You have a digital representation, and that doesn't mean it's a graphical representation. It is a digital. It's the different parts of the data that you capture. And actually the digital twin concept is, how do you relate each of them together to understand what's happening with the real asset, and then to make changes to it based on the modeling data that you've been able to take from it, for instance. So the problem with roles is every project or every organization will be slightly different. And again, you know, you could argue that you have a core competence sort of role. You're a qualified civil engineer or a mechanic, you know, those sort of hard disciplines. And then we talk about what are our skill sets. So you may have someone that's employed as a data scientist, but just like you might have a project manager that is a civil engineer that's become a project manager or become an engineering manager, it goes back to that life experience. So having a data scientist that has no understanding of the built environment means that they're very good at data, but they don't necessarily relate to the realities of what it means to be involved and how to design and construct, which is why we need to move towards these sort of quasi roles. And that can only come from, if we're digitally enabling our qualified staff, you know, we have the new people coming in is only a small percentage of our existing staff, and it comes back to training and developing what we already have, and then understanding what skills your existing staff have, and accept the fact that they might not all be able to do what you want of them in the future. But it's understanding where that's happening to make a decision on how do you want to approach that. And that will be different for every organization, for every company, because ultimately they need to make that decision about what they need to do to survive, to be profitable. And it might be to bring in some data scientists, but mentor them or bring them in and pair them up with their relevant qualified engineers, etc. You know, and I don't know how that best to work, other than really where organizations and companies are doing that, share, you know, and this is the problem. We need to share as much good practice across industry and leverage that, and we can only do that if we start creating hubs whereby we can start bringing that together, whether it's at client level, whether it's at industry level, whether it's something the BIM4 groups could do. Again, they're all doing it, and that's the argument of government construction strategy with the roadmap versus the industry infrastructure client group and Project 13 saying that client group we need to lead. And then you have different industries, you have your contractors associations. So there's lots going on. My frustration is that, you know, we as individuals can only see and know so much, and there must be amazing stuff going out there, but how do we bring it all together? You know, it's hard.
Yeah, and again, I'm probably reaching the end of my time with you, so thank you for your time and insights. And I know you've mentioned several resources or initiatives there, but I guess just to summarize, are there, and you might have mentioned them already, but if you don't mind just summarizing where people could find more information. So you mentioned client liaison group, for example. Are there any other places?
So what came out of the Centre of Digital Built Britain from a BIM perspective and digital twin is that when Cambridge University stopped as part of that in March, the digital twin hub that was created continued. So in all things digital twin and in an area to collaborate, that still exists, and you can share the links as part of the video, etc. There's a whole host. So I sit on the infrastructure client group, digital transformation task group, and some of that information is published through the ICE's website. There's things we talked about, Project 13, which is about new ways of working. There's the Infrastructure Projects Authority Roadmap to 2030, which is very much driving what government departments are setting out the new IM mandate to deliver BIM, among with lots of other things relating to digital and improvements, etc. There's also the UK BIM Alliance and the BIM4 groups, which are more industry specific. And there's a whole, but this is the point, and then there's a whole raft of other things going on at local level. Construction excellence, southeast and southwest, you know, there's and it goes on and on and on and on, and it's great that it's happening, but it also worries me because how much great stuff is happening in isolation and not necessarily being shared with other people. And it might be a simple case of just who is actually leading it, you know. And this is that argument of government can set certain things, the regulators can set certain things, the client group can set certain things, you know, but even contractors and the supply chains and designers, you know, through REBA and all that, you know, they can control their own group. The key one is that, you know, I think clients do need to lead it, whether that be a government department or a client, to start the process, and they can only work to what's available to them. So things like BIM, having asset information 55,000, having ISO 9001. We talk about cyber and technology with ISO 27001 and others. You know, I think there's so much great stuff out there, you know, but at the end of the day, we all want to just get on with our day job. You know, I have an invested interest in wanting to know what's going on and being involved at industry level to try and force that sharing, and really open up the eyes of people to be aware that there is all this stuff going on. And if you're interested, I think all the BIM4 groups would love involvement within their own group, that if you've got time and you want to know. But this is where it comes down to about our CPD, is that if you really wanted to know, you shouldn't be doing that out of work hours. Your organization, as part of training and investing in yourself and your own expertise, it should be part and parcel of your job role to be able to do that within the time that you've got. I'm not going to say that you shouldn't do out of hour work, because a lot of what we do is typically pro bono, because no one wants to pay for it. However, you know, this is when you have a client that is willing to invest in educating and training and allowing your staff to get involved in these activities, it will only ultimately benefit themselves.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Peter, so much. I could talk all day too, but I think I've probably taken your time. What I'll obviously do is I'll provide links to all the sources that you mentioned at the bottom. So thank you for that. And I completely agree with you. That was also one of the main motivations for doing this podcast. There's so much going on.
Yeah, I know.
There's just
too much going on. Too much.
Yeah, possibly. And I completely agree with you. And again, it also might depend how people identify as well. So, for example, there's horizontals and verticals, and I know we know all this, but again, am I a construction professional? Probably not. But again, you know, there are events you name drop there quite nicely. So thank you, ISO 55000 series, Institute of Asset Management. So again, there's another side of that. But anyway, I'll stop talking. I'll thank you again for your time. Fantastic. So we could only cover so much, but I think there was some great insight there, and thank you for your time, and I really appreciate it. So thank you, Peter Vale.
Thank you, Stephen, as well. Anytime.